Scano. Welcome to the Kayanase Native Plant Gardening webinar series. My name is Gero Deer, and today what we're doing is we're going to demonstrate how to mix soil and sort of behind the scenes how we do it here at Kayanase on a larger scale, but we're also going to demonstrate how you can do it on a smaller scale at home, basically mixing soil and using that soil to fill pot stock or trays, if that's what you choose to do at home to start your plants, whether those are garden plants or vegetables or wildflowers, grasses, things like that. And if you're interested in starting things from seed, which is an option that you can do, so you can direct sow seed onto your property, or you can go ahead and start the seed first and then plant those plants on your property where you think they'll be successful and where you would want a place for native plants to thrive and get all the benefits that you can provide to your health and to the health of your property and the biodiversity of your property as well. Okay, so what I'm going to demonstrate here is just very basic how to mix soil and get a good moisture content for your soil when you're going to be potting up or using trays, whichever it is that you choose to use. This is just a basic potting soil. You can see it's really light and friable and dusty, and it has a number of components mixed into it, pre-mixed into it for holding moisture and holding on to nutrients, supporting root growth, things like that. So that's kind of what the basic structure of potting soil is, and it's important to have uniform moisture content. So if you just put the dry soil in and then you sow your seed, and then you go to water it, sometimes the water will wash your seeds out of the soil if they're very small. And especially if you have a very dry soil and you're putting water onto it, you can have that happen. Another thing that can happen is if you have a lot of dry soil on the bottom of your pot or dry soil on the top, depending on however you mix your soil, you can have the seed dry out as well. So you want to have a nice uniform moisture content through the entire pot of your soil mixture. And the other thing is, if you're incorporating amendments into your soil, so amendments are things like worm castings or fertilizers, or things like vermiculite, things that will hold moisture depending on the species that you're trying to grow. You can mix those in as you're doing this process, and if you're doing it while it's dry, you're going to get a lot of dust. You're going to be breathing in that dust. It's not really healthy. So the other thing I'm going to show is just when you start mixing, is you just start out with a little bit of water just to cover everything, and you can, depending on what you're doing, you can mix too much water, and you don't really want it to be super saturated, but you also again don't want it to be too dry. And so when I started out working with Kayanase in our original greenhouse, this was something that we did a lot of training on, was surprisingly how to mix soil for our greenhouse. And you have to sort of just like cooking or baking, when you're mixing ingredients, there's certain stages where you mix things in. So right now I've added water twice, and I'm starting to get, it's not quite as dusty, and it's good to use your hands to get the feel of the soil as well, because there's a lot of absorbance in here. As you're mixing it, you want to keep feeling the soil, and you feel it gets sort of soft and spongy, and you want to make sure you mix all of the soil, so you want to get right down to the corners. And so I just hit another dry patch, so you'll see it's a little bit dusty. There's more dry soil being mixed in, and if I take a handful of this and I squeeze it, nothing comes out, and so that tells me I need more water. But as far as the moisture content, it's almost perfect. As I squeeze it, I can see the water seeping between my fingers. What I want to see is like 2 to 3 drops coming out of a handful of soil. That's kind of the goal. So I'm just going to add a tiny bit more. And this sort of level of precision is kind of what we were trained on to get the precise moisture content. So at this point I'm just using my hand. And so when I squeeze a handful of soil, you can see 2 to 3 drops coming out. A few more. So that's just about where you want right there. And so, just to demonstrate quickly, when you're potting up, you don't want to over compact the potting soil as you're putting it in. But again, you don't want it too loose either. So just something that over time you get better at, and you're not gonna mess it up too bad, even if you over compact it or if you leave it too loose. But so you have nice moisture content. The soil isn't falling out of the pot. It's kind of like maintaining its form, and that's kind of what you want. That's your goal. Moisture content. This is perfect for potting and seeding, or up potting for smaller stock into bigger stock. And that's kind of the end of my demonstration on mixing soil.
Hello everybody, my name is Victoria and I'm Kayanase's ecologist. I'm going to show you on a larger scale what we do here at Kayanase every day, and this kind of compares to what Girdo showed you with the small scale moisture and soil that you can use at home. So on our scale we are doing lots of sowing and lots of plugs and pots all the time. So we have a large soil machine. The method is the same. We are adding water to the soil until it's at a consistency which you can drip a couple drops out when you squeeze test it. So inside of the machine there is a few arms that turn consistently, and as we add the soil it mixes everything together really well. And there's a pedal underneath that we push that allows the soil to come out right nicely into our trays. So we grab the soil and we squeeze test it the same way we would in our small at-home scale, but this just allows us to get lots of soil done at a really efficient pace, and then it allows us to fill all of these trays really fast as well. So today we're going to be showing you 2 different ways that we use these trays. These are 36 trays, but we do have open trays and 72 plug trays. So there's a lot of different types of ways that we sow and seed here at Kayanase. The 2 different seeds we're going to use today are black raspberry and thicket creeper, and we're going to show you that in these trays.
So for these black raspberry seeds, this year we tried 2 different pre-treatments on them to break their dormancy, because they have a double dormant seed. So the first method we used was using sulfuric acid, and we let it soak in there for about an hour. And for these ones we're trying water. So we soak these in water for 24 hours. And then for sowing these seeds, we put 2 to 3 per cell. And for these ones, they are sown on the surface. So we just put 2 to 3 per cell. And then after we fill them all, we cover with a thin layer of sand so that the seed doesn't wash off when we water, or from wind when we take them outside to our greenhouse. And the sand also allows light to get through, whereas soil, it would be harder for light to get through, to allow the seeds to germinate in the spring. And these seeds require 3-month cold moist stratification. So we start sowing these in February, and we put them in plastic bags to keep the moisture in, and we put them in the fridge for 3 months, and that is their stratification period, which mimics what would happen in nature through winters and summers. All seeds have a different requirement for their cold stratification or warm moist, and also some don't even have a stratification period, so it just depends on each species that you're using, and there are some resources online that you could use to figure that out. So the next seed we're going to be sowing is the thicket creeper, and this one also required a pre-planting treatment. So we soaked this one in water for 24 hours before sowing, and for this one it's 3/8 of an inch deep in the soil, so we just slightly push it in and then after cover it with a thin layer of soil. And for these ones we do 2 to 3 per cell. That's just based on the germination rate of the seeds, and so we hope that one comes up out of those 3. This is a vine that you often find on the forest floor or growing up trees. So after we sow all the seeds, before we put them in the bags into the fridge, we mist them just to make sure that there's still moisture in each of the cells so that the seeds don't dry out. And also it's very important to label your pots or your tray of plugs. For us, we put the Latin name and the common name as well as the lot code, and the lot code allows us to trace back to where exactly we collected the seed, so we can learn lots from that, like different populations that had a high germination rate, and also just our customers and for our restoration projects, they sometimes want to know where the seed was collected. Start right here.
Welcome back to the Kayanase Native Plant Gardening webinar series. And we're on location here at Chiefswood Park here in Six Nations. And we're looking at some shrub species that we can utilize on our property propagating with stem cuttings. And so this is useful for establishing populations of these species on our property. So this species we're looking at here is elderberry. And you can't do it with all shrubs, but there are a few that you can have some success transplanting from cuttings with, from the wild. Only thing to keep in mind is when you are growing plants from cuttings is that you are basically cloning the original parent plant. And then so you do have to grow things from seed periodically to ensure genetic diversity. But as far as establishing a population on your property or on a restoration site, you can use cuttings to get that plant in place, stabilizing soil, providing habitat, providing biodiversity. And it's a method that works well, and it's a method that you can deploy in a short period of time. So the best time or an ideal time to gather your cuttings is going to be at the end of February, early March, when things are still dormant. They're not waking up at all yet. Everything in the root system is still resting, and so that's when we can gather these things. And then when we go to transplant them, we can either put them into potted stock and grow them like in a greenhouse setting, or we can put them directly into the ground. So the only important thing to remember is when you're gathering these is to keep them cool. And so some people will store them like in a container outside. As long as it doesn't dry out and desiccate, the cuttings don't dry out, you can keep them stored for the amount of time until the ground is ready for you to drive those cuttings into the soil, and they will grow. When we're approaching sort of a what you call a clump or a population of the species, your target species, when we see these small individuals on the outside, and then you see the taller individuals towards the middle, this is all generally one individual, and it's suckering out from a central plant or a central stem. And over the years of succession, it starts to spread and colonize the soil around it and the habitat around it. And that's how these thickets are formed. And it's a very important habitat for migratory bird species, insect species, pollinator species. They all utilize these types of habitats for various purposes. So birds and small animals and even larger animals like deer will shelter in these thickets from predators and from inclement weather and wind. So it provides a good shelter for animals and birds. And the berries, like for example here, the elderberry, are a food source for birds as well. and they provide the nutrient requirements for birds when they're preparing for migration late in the summer and early fall. And the flowers that emerge before the berries come on early in the summer and in the late spring, those are excellent sources of nectar and pollen for the pollinating insects, so butterflies, moths, and bees, things of that nature. It's also a host for a number of species of moth as well, and so it plays a major role. All of these plants play a major role on the landscape, and so when we incorporate these on our property, we're ensuring that we're going to bring the biodiversity, the benefits for biodiversity into our living space, and we can benefit ourselves from that by having all that diversity around us, and I guess seeing the butterflies and all the things interacting with our property. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to remove some of the central stems. Those are the older stems, so they're the largest, and we're going to get the most from those larger stems, and I'm going to cut it near the base. You can also use the stem, the smaller stems, if that's what you're inclined to do. It's just that you'll have a harder time driving those into the ground. You'll have a better success putting those into a soft soil or a potting soil to start a plant in a more controlled growing setting. I'm just gonna go in here and with my pruners, as far as safety, gloves, making sure you're prepared for the weather and whatnot. These things often grow on the edges of wetlands and stream banks, so you want to be cognizant of that. Also, when you're going into, when you're ducking to make your cut, sometimes these branches are coming in towards your eyes and your face, so you want to just be aware of that. So I'm just going to go in here. So each lenticel on this stem has the potential to grow into a root or a branch, and so when these are driven into the ground, these where your roots are going to be growing from. And so when you're making your cuttings, which we'll show later on, you're going to cut between nodules, or make your cuts between the nodules so that you have the ability to drive it into a growing medium, and the roots will grow from there. What we see here on the stem, hopefully, is the center of the stem is a spongy pith. It's P-I-T-H, pith. And the other important habitat feature for some of these species is, for pollinators specifically, is as the stems die on these, whether the base has been chewed by a rabbit and that causes the stem to die and dry and become brittle, that creates habitat for pollinating insects to burrow into the stem and into that hollow pith and to lay their eggs to produce young for the following spring. So that's how a lot of our native pollinators are overwintering, is in the stems of plants and shrubs that have been sort of hollowed by either by animals or just by natural weathering and death. And so we can see here, if we look closely enough at some of these thickets of our native shrubs, we'll see small holes burrowed into the stem. This is an old burrow, so there's nothing actually living in here right now. But you can see at one point an insect, possibly one of our native bee species, did chew a hole into the stem and burrow in, and likely laid its eggs in there to overwinter. And this is what's happening throughout the summer in these hollow stems, or in these dormant stems in the fall, is that the bees and native bees and other native insects are burrowing in to prepare for their young for overwintering. Most of the adults will expire or die, and the offspring will live in the stem throughout the winter and emerge in the spring. And that's what's going to pollinate all of our fruiting trees and flowers that are on the landscape. So if you look inside this stem here, you can see there's almost looks like a cobweb type material in there, and there's some chewed up stem material in there as well. Some people might refer to that as frass, which is like the leftovers from insects either eating seeds or chewing on something and leave a residue behind from chewing on a plant. matter. And so inside here are the chambers where whatever species this was that burrowed in laid its eggs, and the young developed and emerged. So this is an old stem. It may be a year or more old, and we can find the evidence of these insects going through this life cycle on the landscape if we pay attention and we observe things closely. And oftentimes what you'll see is the outline of a hole, and it'll be stuffed. That's an active chamber or active sort of offspring developing in that plant stem. So when you're out in the thickets or you're out in the shrubs in the winter, you want to be aware of what you're stepping on, because oftentimes you may be destroying habitat or disturbing the life cycle of these species. So with these examples of stems being important nursery habitat for insects and native bees, when it comes to native plant gardening, there's nothing you should be really cutting back from your native plants. Once they're established and the stems go dormant, they're still playing a role, whether they're carrying seed over to the next year or whether they're providing that hollow stem habitat for your pollinating insects. It's important to leave your plants in place. Even in dormancy, they're still providing habitat, they're still providing a benefit to the landscape. So, a lot of people are tempted to clear their garden after the growing season and to clear all their plant residues off of their garden and cut things back. But it's not necessary, and in fact, by leaving it, you're providing habitat and continuing to benefit for things to continue their life cycle. That's a beauty. So another one of our native shrubs we can also use for growing from cuttings is the red osier dogwood. This species, this shrub, is oppositely arranged. It also has small white or cream colored lenticels on the bark, and obviously the bark is very red to purplish. Another key identification feature is again the pith. So on red osier dogwood, the pith is bright white. And if you see a similar looking species here in the community that's very common, it's called the silky dogwood. It'll have a brown pith. So one way to confirm that identification is just to cut the branch, and if you see a bright white pith in the middle, it's red osier. If it's brown or yellowish, it's the silky dogwood. The one that performs well growing from a cutting is the red osier dogwood. So that's the one you generally want to stick with using. And so we have this patch growing here, and we're going to use this to grow some of the cuttings and to apply live stakes. And so again, just like the elderberry, the younger stems, the less mature stems are going to be suckering out towards the edge of the patch. The more mature stems are going to be towards the middle, and so those are the ones we're going to sort of target. So you go towards the middle of your patch, and I'll pick some of these, and Victoria there will pick some of the ones behind me here. We have a couple of different patches. I believe they're different individuals. So just like before, you go to the base and you cut from the base. So again, very important species for pollinating insects, as well as for stabilizing soils. And so it can tolerate moisture. And so again, this is something we're going to use. We can use for places where we have high moisture content on our properties, on our landscapes. But it can also survive in drier, more moderate soils as well. And so oftentimes you'll see it growing in the field or on a hillside, not necessarily in connection to a saturated or watery site. And the flowers of this species are a very important source of nectar for pollinators. The berries that grow on this species, they're a white colored berry. They're very important for migratory birds to build up fat in the fall for their winter migration. So it's a very important species to have for providing that habitat and biodiversity to the wildlife around us. This is also a very important medicinal species here in the community. And so the more you can encourage these plants to grow on our properties, then we're connecting with the medicine in another way. So maybe we're not necessarily gathering it and harvesting it to make into medicine, but the fact that we're incorporating it into our landscape is another way we can engage with our traditional medicines as well. So we're still here at Chisu Park, and what we're doing here is we're gathering stems of the Phragmites. And Phragmites is this big patch of this tan-colored, really tall, grassy, almost like a bamboo-looking plant. You see it commonly on roadsides, and the species is Phragmites australis. And Phragmites australis is an invasive species in North America. It was introduced sometime in the 1800s, and it's spread rapidly. And one of the issues with this species is because it spreads vegetatively through the roots, is that it does occupy a lot of habitat very rapidly, and it starts to push out some of our native wetland species, and it alters the habitat for things like migratory waterfowl, beavers and muskrats, and some of the keystone species that are interacting in our wetlands. So it's very important that we recognize when our property is being invaded by invasive species. This is one of the main ones that we want to be aware of. And if you have a small patch on your property and you're able to mow it, that's a very simple way to control this. All the energy is coming from the root, and even a small shred of the root, once it's introduced to the soil, can grow into and start a new invasion in an area. So what we're doing here is we're utilizing this invasive species to support habitat. The way we're doing that is we're cutting the stems, and we're cutting them into small bundles. And so if you see, Victoria here has actually cut a bunch of the stems, and it produces, what we're trying to produce are these straws. And what we're going to do is we're going to bundle these straws into large bundles, and we're going to seat these into containers, and we're going to set these up around our property. And what we're doing is we're sort of mimicking the hollow stem burrowing habitat for our native bees. Almost all of our native bees are going to utilize some sort of a burrowing method, whether it's in the soil, whether it's in wood, or whether it's in a hollow stem. What we're trying to do is provide that habitat and encourage those native bees to grow on our property and to thrive there, so they can provide all the benefits that they bring to our native plants. So this is an example. When we're harvesting this, we want to ensure that when we cut down the stem, that we're controlling the seed head, and we're taking that and we're bagging the seed head. On that seed head there are hundreds of seeds. Not all of them are viable. They actually have a low viability, but we want to reduce the chance of any seeds blowing off as we're gathering it and continuing the infestation as much as possible. What we're left with is this stem, and we can just keep cutting the stem down, and as we cut it, we start to produce these straws. And when we have the straws bundled together, then that creates a nice potential for habitat for our native bees. Another thing is that these, once they're set into their where we're going to establish our habitat, is they're not going to rot nearly as quickly as some other materials like wood, and they're not going to be as moldy. They're going to be less prone to mold growing inside. So that's important for the offspring of the bee as they're developing. We don't want the plant to sort of deteriorate as it's developing throughout the winter, and so this will stay persistent throughout the winter. This stem material, and we can use certain types of wood for drilling holes into as well. It's another type of bee habitat we can produce. But for now, we're just gathering these stems to encourage homeowners to not only reduce the potential for invasive species by controlling the seed heads, but also to utilize those species using the stems to create that pollinator habitat on your property. Something you can look into and practice doing as you're expanding your knowledge about incorporating native species, not only the plants but the pollinators themselves as well, into your property and into the space that you interact with.
So we have brought our red osier dogwood and elderberry back to Kayanase here, and I'm going to show you how we go from something this large to live stakes that we can actually put into the ground, something like this. So for starters, we always want one end of our live stake to have a rough 35 to 45 degree angle cut on it, and that's what's going to be shoved into the ground. And then you want this top spot to be very flat, and it helps with hammering it down really nicely, and it also just keeps the right side upright. So when you have something this large, we aren't going to be able to stake everything. They're not going to survive. So what you want to start by doing is cutting all these smaller branches off. You can place them aside. So these two here, this separation, these are still thick enough to use as live stakes. So what you can do is cut each of these off as well. And you have your first one right here. And again, you're going to want to make sure there's a nice 35 to 45 degree angle along the bottom. And you can put that aside. This one is far too thin to be used as a live stake, and the chance of survival is pretty low. But we can cut it up just the same. You can keep the little twigs on this time. And what we'll do is we'll keep these for brush mattresses. These can still be used, just not necessarily for these purposes. So we'll stick these aside. So taking the top branch, we can cut this up again into some more smaller parts. This stem here is a little bit too thin to be used, so we'll just cut it and add it to our other pile here. This one as well, too thin. You can just start by trimming all these thin branches off first, and then you know what you're working with. So this top part here, again, is a little bit too thin, but this bottom part is pretty thick. It has a good chance of survival. So you can cut your 45 degree angle along the bottom here and just trim off this top thin part. This way, this whole thing can still fit under the ground when you try and stake them in. These can go aside, and same with this one. We're going to cut off all these small, less functional stems. And you don't necessarily have to do this. You can leave them on. It just makes it a little nicer when you're planting. But this one again, too thin. Cut that guy off. But this guy has a pretty good bottom. Again, these are still kind of thin, so you would stake them knowing that there is a lesser chance of survival, but they're at a decent size that they could still work. And I would just cut right about here. You want them long enough that when you stake them in, you can still have about a third to a quarter above the ground. So you do want most of this underneath, and you're only going to see about this much at the top when you do plant them. So those are the dogwoods. So these elderberries, we did cut most of them up in the field, and we found some were quite thin, but we did get a couple of good thick pieces. So again, we want to keep these thin ones even though we're not going to be staking them, and we'll set them aside. But you can see the thickness of these and the length of these are probably perfect. They are going to be able to root and sucker at the bottom and outside of all of these lenticels, and it doesn't really matter which side you choose to be your top or your bottom. You just want to have one of them at a 45 degree angle, and that's what you're going to be shooting into the ground. So there's kind of a multitude of different methods to stick these into the ground. The easiest one, depending on the ground conditions, is to just stick them in. And you want them to be in the ground most of the way. You only really want a third to a quarter sticking up out of the ground, just like that. And you want that 45 degree angle in. This side was cut, both sides had 45 degree angles, but for the most part you'll only have one. When the ground is really hard, if you're doing this before everything's warmed up and the ground is still frozen, you can use a mallet or you can use an iron bar, and you can put a hole in the ground first. But when you use a mallet, you're going to stick that 45 degree in as well, and you're just going to lightly bring it all the way down. And you don't want to damage the top too much, but that being said, you are hitting it with a mallet, so a little bit of damage is okay. And you're going to stick it in as far as you can. This is obviously not as deep as the ground would be. You would want about this much sticking up from the ground, anywhere from a third to a quarter of the top sticking out. And in practice, you want to have maybe 4 or 5 of these per square meter. You want them distanced far enough apart that they can establish on their own, and you want them to not kind of compete with each other. That defeats the purpose a little bit. But these root very well and very fast, so you should start to see new growth in the first probably 2 years.
All right, so when you're in the field and you're driving these in, sometimes the stake will encounter rocks and other debris in the ground, or just be tough ground. And as you're hitting it, this will start to fray and split sometimes. And so you can come along with your loppers after the installation and just remove the damaged portion with your loppers there, and so you have a clean cut. And because when you do have the fraying up top here and the splits, that can increase the evaporation rate, and your steak will dry out quicker, and that can reduce the survival rate of your live steaks. So that's the only other thing I would add, is sometimes in the field you do have to clean the tops up once your steaks are installed in the ground. So now that we've gone through and trimmed our branches and made our steaks, what we have often is an abundance of cut off branches that you can either discard, or you can actually choose to use these as part of your restoration or as part of your property development. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to make a fascine, and the way that we do that is simple, basic. We just take all their cut off branches, all the small branches that we were going to discard, and we make them into sort of almost like a sausage type of a bundle. And we're just going to stack all the branches together, and we're going to start at the bottom end. And yeah, it's good if you have help, good someone to sort of hold it together. And we start at one end. It doesn't have to all be from like bottom to top. It can be just unsorted, stacked together into one bundle. And you don't need any sort of a fancy knot or anything. You just take, the best thing is some biodegradable twine like this, baler twine here. And you just start out with a very simple overhand knot. So you have some tension there. And all you're gonna do is just wrap this around. And wherever you wrap it underneath, you're gonna hold your finger there and pull your string back through. And you just rock it back and forth to increase the tension, tighten it up. And you're gonna slide it down a little. And again, use your finger to trap it. Put your hand underneath. Slide it back through. Pull that through again. And rock it back and forth. Create some tension, cinch it down. Slide it over a little bit more. And the good thing about this is you can just take all of your cut-offs from all your different species. And if you have an area, maybe it's a place that you're just trying to restore, it's not necessarily part of the area that you're going to have visible, just a sort of wild area or off to the side where you can install this. You can mix these species together. As you see here, we have 2 different species mixed together. Or you can keep them as separate species, it's up to you. But this is a very effective way to use these branches, and they will grow once they're installed. And you can have great success stabilizing shorelines and embankments with this method. So once you get to the end, again, it's anything, there's no particular knot that's going to be better as long as it's held together. So I would just pass the running end through where I have it looped around already. Pull that through and just do an overhand knot, just so it'll hold itself together, cinch it down. This is your fascine. So some of these you can make actually very large depending on how much branches you have. And all you're going to do is you're going to dig a trench in the ground deep enough to bury this. And once you set this inside of the trench and you bury that and you pack it down and you just leave it, that's all you do. And these will sprout and they'll form sort of like growing walls of the elderberry or dogwood or willow, whatever it is that you're trying to establish. So you can set these along embankments. So dig a small trench along the embankment, install this, and that'll create sort of a barrier and stabilize the soil in layers. So like when you have sort of rain or gravity coming down on the soil, and these things will be there to capture it and establish themselves. So this is a good way to utilize those cut-off branches and create more habitat.
So, like we said before, we collected some Phragmites at Chesapeake Park, and we don't really want to create a lot of waste, so we like to reuse as much as we can. And these can be used for pollinator habitat all throughout the winter, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to show you how to create that on your own property and also how to integrate it into your own landscapes. So you can cut these to any size you'd like. Ideally, you want them to be a little bit longer. If they're too short, oftentimes they'll be overlooked in comparison to other potential habitat sources. And you're gonna lay them all out kind of here. You're gonna pull out stuff that doesn't fit, stuff that's too small. And the same as we made the fascines, you can grab some biodegradable twine, and you can do them in as large or as small sizes as you want. So you can make them this small, or you can make this whole thing into one giant pollinator habitat. I'm going to pull out the longer ones and try and make this all the same length roughly. I'm going to tie these all together. And there's multiple methods. You can use string, you can tie it all together. You can also glue it together so long as you don't block either end of these holes. So I'm going to take these ones. Let's see, you want to string it around or hold them? And all you have to do, the simplest way, is just string it around, and same as the fascine, doesn't matter what kind of knot you have, you just want to tie it tight enough to hold. Want to do a double? And you can place this or hang this kind of anywhere within your garden. And it's very simple. Then what you'll have is pollinators, whether that be native bees, other little insects will burrow inside of these holes, and they'll overwinter in them, or even just lay their eggs in them. And then the following year, you have a whole new population of pollinators. So you can do it this way, very simple. You can hang these, you can have enough string to hang them, but you can also glue them all together to be a little more secure. And like I said, you can have multiple different sizes. You can have some really little ones, kind of everywhere. You can also glue them all together kind of long ways instead of in a bundle, and you can lay them somewhere. There's a whole bunch of different methods that you can use, but the most important part is that both sides are open and accessible, and this way you're allowing burrowing happening from both sides, and then there is no kind of predation happening. So we made pollinator habitat out of these Phragmites stems, and it's really important to recognize that everything has a function in our ecosystems, so we don't want to waste any materials when we don't have to. This is very important when the fall time comes. You don't necessarily want to be raking up all your leaves because it provides adequate habitat for animals to lay their eggs and to grow over winter until the springtime comes when they're able to bloom. So a great example of this is our tulip tree, and Gerda will tell you more about that.
So our tulip tree here at Kayanase is a very important part of the Carolinian forest, and we do grow these species here in the greenhouse for projects and for retail sale. What we see on our tree is the pupal stage of the tulip tree silk moth, and so these moths will lay their eggs on the tulip tree in the summer, and in the late summer, early fall, as the caterpillar is growing, it'll actually go onto the leaf and wrap itself in the leaf to overwinter. And so as it overwinters, it will emerge in the spring to continue the life cycle of this moth. The tulip tree is, like I said, an important member of the Carolinian forest, and it's an important member of the eastern forest of North America. The tree can grow to massive sizes, and it sort of creates a very important habitat in itself for a host of birds and insects. And the inflorescence that it produces is also an important source of nectar for many pollinating insects and birds as well. The tallest tree in eastern North America is a tulip tree, and so these trees, as I said, can grow to massive sizes. And so it's something that we can, as we incorporate native species onto our properties, these are things that we look forward to for our future to establish themselves, so that someday there may be a massive 190-foot tree growing on our property for all of our future generations to enjoy, and all of the species and biodiversity to be supported by that tree.